Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to check out the new Sony a6700. There has been a lot of anticipation for what Sony are going to do with an APS-C format camera. A lot of expectations. Does this camera live up to it? Well, it's complicated, but let's dig into that. So there's a lot of things that Sony did right on this camera, and a lot of things that I'm really happy to see. It's been a long time since we've had an update in the APS-C range from Sony, and so they have really brought this camera current to spec in what we see with things like the A7 IV, in some ways the A7R5 with the autofocus system. So inside the camera, we now have a 26 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor, and we also have the Bionz XR image processing engine. So this does extend the AI-driven autofocus features that we've seen in recent cameras such as the A7R5. We now also have 10-bit video recording, so we're gonna get 14 stops of dynamic range if you're using S-Log3. The sensor readout in terms of speed has also been much improved, and that's a complaint that a lot of us had, myself included, with even the a6700, and now we get less of the jello shutter effect. And so even though we don't have a stacked CMOS sensor in this camera, this is pretty fast. Autofocus is going to be one of the highlights of this camera, and it's the biggest improvement over its predecessor. I mentioned before, we now have the AI-based real-time tracking. We've got 759 phase detection autofocus points covering 93% of the image area. Autofocus is impressive. Of course, this also means that we have all of the advanced subject recognition and all of the menu settings that we have with the A7R5. And so if autofocus is really your thing and you're really specific about that, I can't think of a better system in terms of features and options that you're gonna have. Sony is pretty much the gold standard for this. For video, we're gonna get up to 4K with full pixel readout. We've got 6K oversampling. As I mentioned, it is 10-bit video, all intra. We could do 4K 120p now, albeit with, well, it's got a pretty serious crop, but it can be done. Of course, all of the AI-based real-time tracking and autofocus recognition is available in movie mode as well. And if you'd like to shoot manual focus for movie mode, we now have the focus map that first debuted with the A7 IV. There have also been some slight changes to the body that we have on this camera. Now, Sony are kind of known for having a body style, and you can expect minor incremental changes over various models over time. I think that the APS-C lineup has really kind of stuck with the same thing for a long time, and it's nice to see some improvements on this. The first improvement is we do have a larger grip. It is significantly bigger than what we saw in the a6600, and APS-C cameras, especially for Sony, is going to be a compact affair. They really are serious about that. It's going to be a small camera. That's something I actually like, and so it's nice just to have a bigger grip, and I think people with bigger hands are going to appreciate that as well. And we now have a fully articulating touchscreen rather than the weird flip over screen that we had on the a6600. That is a very welcome addition. You're also going to see that the mode dial has been separated into a dial with a sub-dial. So if you want to select between stills, movie, or S and Q modes, you're going to do that on the lower dial, and then you're going to select your mode selection at the top. And many of you are going to be excited that finally there is a front-facing dial that will sit under your index finger while shooting. That's something we've been missing for a while. On the back of the camera, one of the biggest changes you're going to notice is the inclusion of the AF on button. This is a big deal for people like myself. I know there's a lot of folks that like to use back button autofocus, and it's just super comfortable, it's super convenient, and it is there. Now, we still only have one SD card slot, and I think a lot of that has to do with Sony's insistence on this camera staying compact, but we do get audio jacks for both mic input and headphone output, USB-C charging and power delivery, and micro HDMI. Again, it's a size thing. But one of my favorite additions is finally this camera's been brought up to current spec with the multi-interface shoe. So this is great for running audio options. If you want to use the Sony microphone, or in my opinion, I think the most power you're going to get in most versatility is if you use their connection interface that allows for XLR inputs on microphones as well as phantom power. Then you can pretty much use any mic you want. And the best part is they go into the hot shoe. There are no cables on this camera hanging off at all. So I've been using this camera for a couple weeks now, and I've used a variety of lenses, mainly the 16 to 55, but I also have used some of my full frame G Master lenses, and you're gonna have a crop factor, but you do get the image quality. This camera is actually very impressive, and there's a lot of things that I like to see that have been brought up to date. I think if you're a video shooter, you're really gonna love the fact that you've got 10-bit video in here now. Of course, we had that with the FX30, but to have it in this lineup, I think it's a much improved and welcome feature over the a6600. And for still shooters, autofocus is a big deal. And this is the same AI autofocus system that we have in the more recent cameras like the A7R5. It does require a dedicated processing unit to do that. You can get a lot of specifics in there, and just depending on what you do, and if autofocus is your thing, I think you're really going to be impressed with this camera. The image quality is outstanding. Now, as I mentioned, this is a preview preview of the camera. It's not a review at this point. And mainly I say that because I've had the camera a couple weeks, I've been shooting on it, but nothing will read the raw files at this point. I've got to wait for software updates. So having said that, I've been shooting in JPEG mode and everything looks great. It's just I can't push the files really hard to kind of see where the breaking point is, but it all looks great. In fact, most of the images that you're seeing in this video, some of these have been processed using my own preset packs. This is a project that I spent about 2 years creating the looks of various film stocks for both Fujifilm and even Kodak. Last year, I decided to make them available for anyone to use, so if you want to get the classic looks of Kodachrome, Fujifilm, Provia, and many others, with all the benefits of shooting digitally, you might want to check these out. I'll put a link in the show description if you're interested in learning more. They work for Adobe Lightroom, Adobe Photoshop using Adobe Camera Raw, as well as Capture One. Highly recommend you check these out if you're interested in getting the classic film simulation look. So a few observations on the Sony a6700. There's a lot that I like about this. Unfortunately, there's a major Achilles heel for me on this, and I'll get into it in a second, but I do want to say that this is an important lineup for Sony. Sony has obviously put a lot of effort and they've become known for their full-frame cameras, but I think when you look at the success that Fujifilm have had with APS-C, I think even when you consider that the cinema line from Sony has started to merge with Alpha somewhat with cameras like the FX3 or the FX30, there's a strong argument for a super 35mm sensor, which would equate to APS-C. There are also a few technical advantages that you have, and this is why I've always owned Sony APS-C cameras, especially when you're shooting macro or you want something where you're going to be working up close with a very shallow depth of field, and I think the same thing goes for video. You can get the same light input from the camera, but because of the crop factor, you're going to have a different depth of field perception with the focal length of the lens, and I think there are a number of arguments that technically validate why APS-C is actually very important to have in the lineup. Having said that, a lot of people have anticipating that Sony would release a pro-level camera, and while I think this certainly has pro-level features in it, there's some small things that would keep this from, I think, a lot of people's definition of a pro camera. For instance, the single card slot for video shooters, the micro HDMI output, it's just tiny and those cables tend to snap sometimes. But for me personally, there is one aspect of this camera that unfortunately is a big disappointment for me, and it is the viewfinder. Now this thing looks good on the spec sheet, but when you actually get into using it, this is the same complaint that I had with the A7C. Love the camera, love the form factor, love the ergonomics involved, but it's tiny viewfinder. So we're talking about a 2.36 million dot OLED EVF. Sony are saying that the brightness is almost as equal to the A7R5. Okay, great, it's bright. It specs out with a 1.07x magnification. It's 120 frames per second, but it's just barely usable. It's just so small, and I had the same complaint with the A7C. I don't think, because when you look at the way this specs out, that Sony are being cheap about this. I don't think it's a cost issue as much as it is a size issue. And Sony are very insistent on keeping their cameras compact, and I totally understand it. It's actually one of the things that I like about it. My solution to this, if I were ever asked, would be to do what Leica does, and you actually, for the M cameras, the hot shoe interface will support an external viewfinder, so you can make a really nice viewfinder and you can use it as an option. And I think this would be something that would fit in with Sony's lineup, I think, in a really cool way. Like, for instance, some camera models clearly kind of overlap in terms of what they'll do. I'll give you an example. For the A7S III, it is very similar to the FX3, and I own both, and I use both, and they're differentiated now because, well, one strongly needs a firmware update that will do the focus breathing compensation, just saying, Sony. The biggest difference between those two models is one has a viewfinder, one does not. So if you like to shoot video and you need the viewfinder, A7S III has one of the best viewfinders, at least at the point that that camera was made, that was available. It's really good. You don't have it on the FX3. One could also see a similarity with a camera like the FX30 and how that relates to what we see in the APS-C lineup. So one of my points would be, if you did an external viewfinder, then you're giving people an option. Another question would be, is this a camera I would actually buy myself? Now, let me preface this by saying I've owned a ton of Sony APS-C cameras. They were making APS-C cameras before they were making full-frame cameras. In fact, that's kind of when I got into Sony's and I really understood that the mirrorless thing was very different. And it all started with me with the NEX7, I had the NEX5, the NEX6, had an A5100, and most recently I've had the A6300, which during the pandemic became my webcam, and I do own the A6600. So as one who's had way too many APS-C cameras, I don't necessarily need another one without getting rid of a few of them, and that actually is an option. And the reason that I think that is because the upgrades in this camera, especially 10-bit video, and especially the autofocus algorithms, have really brought this up into being a modern Sony camera. And so if you see a technical use case in your own life for an APS-C camera, I think this is probably the best you're going to be able to do with Sony. It competes very closely with some of the Fujifilm offerings. However, Fujifilm still have a few features that Sony hasn't put in, and they view those cameras as sort of their flagships, so you're going to see like dual card slots and things like that. Another thing that I want to point out is when you look at any manufacturer who makes both APS-C as well as full-frame cameras, and I'm talking about the big ones, so it'd be Sony, Nikon, Canon, there is a little bit of a stigma that full-frame is going to be more professional and better quality, and that APS-C cameras are treated as maybe beginner level or amateur people just getting into it. And as a result, the models that a lot of those companies offer tend to be on the entry level kind of thing. I think the a6700 is above entry level, but a lot of times decisions are made that just, it's going to delineate this lineup from the full frame cameras, and I think that's kind of unfortunate. I would love to see Sony continue this lineup and actually give us some professional offerings. I think if nothing else, Fujifilm has proven over the years that APS-C cameras can be pretty dang good. And I want to note that Sony today also released this lens, which is a 70-200mm f4 macro telephoto lens, and this is kind of one of my favorite things that they've done in a long time. I have a whole separate video on that, so if you want to see that, I will link it up here. If you have any questions about the a6700, please drop them in the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later. You're going to want this lens.